Hello. I want to virtually welcome everyone watching to the Whole Center for Buddhist Studies at Stanford University. I would like to welcome Taro Gold, best-selling author and co-author with Tina Turner and Regular Corti of Happiness Becomes You, A Guide to Changing Your Life for Good, and Dan Lindsay and TJ Martin, Oscar and Emmy-winning directors of the HBO Films documentary, Tina. I'm Ralph, and I will moderate our discussion. Please submit your questions through the Q&A function, and we'll answer them during the Q&A section. But without further ado, I want to dive right into our conversation, starting with Dan and TJ. Now, Dan and TJ, you directed Undefeated, a sports documentary, which won an Oscar in 2012. You also directed LA 92, about the 1992 LA riots, which won an Emmy in 2017. And now, Tina, your first music documentary. How did you get involved in this project?
Dan, you want to field that one?
Well, I'll try and, I don't know how interesting of a story it is, so I'll try and give the short version of it. But the producers who did our last film, LA 92, had actually developed a relationship with Tina and her husband, Erwin, based on doing some work around the lead up to the premiere of the musical Tina in London. And through that relationship, they had kind of pitched the idea to Tina about doing a kind of definitive documentary on her life and career. And she agreed and thought that the time was right to do it. And so they approached us to direct it. And TJ and I were kind of a little taken back at first. We kind of were like, why us? We had some concerns about two men helming Tina's story. Right. We talked a bit, we were very aware of Tina and kind of awe of her as an icon, but we definitely wouldn't be considered diehard fans by any means. But as children of the 80s and growing up as MTV generation, we're very aware of Tina. And as kind of music nerds in a way, we, as we grew older and kind of dove back into the history of music, became very aware of her music with Ike. And we kind of jumped into the film without really fully even knowing exactly what our approach would be in many ways. We kind of, along with the producers and with Tina and Erwin, I think had the confidence that we'd find a direction, and ultimately, we did. You can see that in the film, kind of, in some ways, and I'm sure we'll talk about it, but it's exploring Tina's relationship to her story is a lot of what we were kind of interested in exploring in the film.
TJ.
No, I mean, that's pretty much it. I mean, look, one of the things when Dan said we were kind of hesitant, one of the reasons why is also we often get asked to do, kind of celebrity driven docs or like cultural figures, like profiles on cultural figures. And specifically in the music space, oftentimes it's more like using the celebrity as a means to kind of explore their musical catalog. And usually the label's involved in some way, shape, or form. So we've always kind of avoided those because for us, it's, story comes first. And to Dan's point, we knew the broad strokes of her story, but it wasn't until we read, I, Tina, the book with that she co-wrote Kurt Loder, that we actually kind of realized that she had lived such a unique and incredible life. And I think that got us a little bit more interested in realizing that we could follow our instincts as storytellers and not trying to just service the music per se. Can it be story first and music second, music and performance second? Obviously, as we all know, you can't extract what happens on stage and what happens off stage to kind of run parallel with each other in terms of her narrative. So it was kind of it ended up working out in terms of our instincts. It ended up working out. It was a good fit.
Well, and I want to come back to that, but especially because the documentary has been so successful. So clearly something worked in that approach. But before we talk about that, I want to ask you the same question, Taro. So you wrote a number of best-selling books, right, including Open Your Mind, Open Your Life, and Living Wabi Sabi. So how did you come to co-author Happiness Becomes You with Tina Turner?
Yeah, for the past 15 years or so, I visit Switzerland about once a year. And in 2014, I met Regula Kurti there in Zurich and her wonderful husband, Beat Kurti, and we became good friends. And on the very first day that we met, we discovered a lot of synchronicities in our life, our mutual love of Buddhism and chanting and music, and also there were a lot of intersections with our lives and Tina. And you know, Regula is a close friend of Tina's and her neighbors, and for years they've worked together on the Beyond music projects, the interfaith music projects. In my case, I had basically grown up as a teenager in the same kind of circle of friends and Buddhist community that Tina talks about in Happiness Becomes You in West LA and Southern California. And so I also had some friends that worked with Tina in the 90s in the Wildest Dreams tour, and I got to go around the world with them to several countries, which was really wonderful. So anyway, fast forward to 2014, and Regula mentioned to me that Tina had always wanted to write a book like Happiness Becomes You, that she'd been talking about it for 30 years or something. And so we quickly realized that the two of us together could help make that a reality if Tina wanted to, and she certainly did. And but at that time, Tina was going through a lot of medical treatments, various issues she had. So the timing wasn't right. But in 2019, we were finally able to start moving forward with that and help Tina create this book that was, as she says, a book about her path to happiness.
Hmm. So what's so interesting to me about that's right, you kind of come to it in different ways, right? So for TJ and Dan, maybe a little more hesitant to kind of take it on, like you said, or two men, is that two men the right people to tell the story, so on and so forth. Is it's going to be a music tribute or something like that? But Taro, in a sense, is right different because you kind of wanted to dive in and kind of put forward this project and things like that. What about these two different ways? And how do you feel now for TJ, Dan, Taro? Right now that you've done it, how do you feel?
I mean, I'll speak for us. I think we're very excited. I think it's just always the amount of time and effort that we know goes into each film that we make. It's a hard decision on what to say yes to, because we want to make sure that that there is something that the film is going to speak to something bigger than maybe just the surface level story. And maybe it was an instinctual thing for us with Tina. Again, as TJ said, we knew the broad strokes, but I don't think we fully knew the nuance and the subtext we would be able to explore within her story. And so, yeah, it was a very strange time, not to get into the geeky filmmaking part of this, but this was a very strange process for us, because in making this film, we were in the middle of the edit when the pandemic happened. And this is the first film we've ever made where we never screened it for people beforehand, where we would have the opportunity to be in a theater and feel how a crowd is watching it, how a group of people are watching it. And so in many ways we finished this and it just kind of went out. And so, to speak to your point, it's been very satisfying for us that after putting in the amount of work, that a lot of the things we were hoping would come through in the subtext of the film seemed to have really resonated with people. And that's just on a personal level, that's what we're trying to do as as filmmakers. So to answer your question directly, it's been that part of it is very satisfying.
Mhm.
You have to excuse me, I missed the question. I was frozen for like, you all were frozen on my end for like 2 minutes. So I don't know, I just kind of came in and Dan was talking. So
Oh, so the question was how, now that both of these projects are out there, right? The doc is out there, the book is out there. I was asking how you feel after your initial hesitancy, right, to take on the doc. How do you feel now?
yeah, I think probably the biggest thing, well, is to Dan, the thing that I caught what Dan was saying is the biggest thing is definitely seeing that that the film has resonance with an audience, specifically, you know, the direction with which we chose to tell, you know, what aspects or facet of her story that we chose to tell. Taro, as I think you probably know, there's, to do Tina's story justice, you probably need to do like a 10-part series, like every facet of her story, and every just kind of plot point of her story could be its own film. You know, it also embodies a lot of different genres, right? It's kind of a, for lack of better terms, it's kind of like a rags to riches story. It's you know, it's kind of it's a story of overcoming the odds. There's so many elements that she navigates. So, you know, we kind of chose a specific lane, and we were really nervous that diehard fans specifically that want to hear certain hits, we're not necessarily going to be satisfied, because we were just not going to do, we were not going to make that film. And to see that to see at least what we've recognized on social media is people being very vocal in kind of recontextualizing their understanding of her story, was something that we also went through over the process of making it. And to see that actually has kind of spurred a conversation in terms of, you know, what not her role, but how she's perceived in culture, right? Here's this, you know, we always talk about her as this woman of strength and resilience, to the point where she's become the symbol that got almost like calcified. And she wasn't anything but that in the eyes of many people. And so for us to kind of humanize her again, and to show, you know, in her case, the fact that she's still navigating and struggling and processing the trauma of her past, I think is just something that people may have just, you know, she's a heroine, and she's over that, right? I think that's something that was maybe a bit of news for people. So, you know, now to see that we were able to actually, to answer your questions, to feel and see that we were able to add value to her story, considering it's been told in so many different mediums in so many different times, is humbling, you know?
In a second, I want to turn specifically to Buddhism in the film, but it's Taro, how does it feel? The book is out, it's done well.
Oh, yes. Well, it feels great. You know, and it's such an honor, of course, to work on this book. You know, for us, I could speak for myself and Regula and Tina as the three co-authors of this book. It was a huge relief also, because, you know, we'd actually started, you know, putting together an outline and really focusing on what we wanted to do way back in 2014, as I mentioned. So, and then because of, you know, medical reasons, we had to delay. So, so yeah, so it was a huge honor, huge relief. We were so excited to finally, you know, get it done. And especially, I think, for me and for Regula to be able to help Tina to put this part of her life out there. As TJ was saying, you know, one of the challenges with making a book like Happiness Becomes You is that there are so many aspects of Tina's life, including her spirituality and her wisdom and all the life lessons she's gained from everything she's gone through, was like picking which do we focus on, you know, which is the most important, which would resonate the most out into the world. We could, honestly, I think we could have written three books with from the well of Tina's wisdom. So anyway, but so that's been incredibly satisfying and emotional and spiritual for me. I learned so much during the process as well, and just like the guys were saying, you know, the response from all around the world has been so positive. from everybody, from even people who didn't even know about Tina. You know, a lot of folks pick it up because they're interested in Buddhism or spirituality or whatever, self-help type books. And they gain a lot out of it. And of course, Tina's fans as well. So that's also been extremely satisfying to see how this book has really kind of transcended all the various, you know, categories of book readers that there are out there.
So we're waiting for parts 2 and 3 of the book, up to part 10 of the documentary. But I want to turn now specifically to Buddhism in the film. And so I want to show about a 4.5 to 5 minute clip of the middle of the documentary. And then I want to discuss that. I love that part of the movie.
So do I.
I love it. That into the leaving, right? But I specifically want to ask, you know, for Taro, you know, this clip shows Tina's introduction to Soka, Gakkai, Nichiren Buddhism. So can you tell us a little bit about Nichiren Buddhism and the Soka Gakkai International? You know, what is their practice? What are some of their core concepts?
Sure, I'd be happy to. Can you hear me? I was muted there for a second.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, so as we saw in that beautiful sequence that Dan and TJ created for the film, which is also one of my favorite parts, Tina was chanting Nam Myoho Renge Kyo, as well as reciting some portions of the Lotus Sutra, which in the Soka Gakkai tradition is done twice a day, morning and evening. And the concise translation of Nam Myoho Renge Kyo, which is what Tina was chanting, is devotion to the mystic law of cause and effect, which sometimes is also interpreted as the universal law of cause and effect through sound vibration or Buddha wisdom. And this practice of chanting Nam Myoho Renge Kyo originated with a Buddhist reformer and philosopher in Japan in the 13th century. His name was Nichiren, and he taught that the essence of all the Buddhist teachings is really contained in the title of the Lotus Sutra, which is Myoho Renge Kyo, or Nam Myoho Renge Kyo when it's chanted. And so that's what you heard Tina doing there so beautifully in that little excerpt. And by chanting Nam Myoho Renge Kyo, as Tina was talking about, Nichiren taught that we can open up this vast wellspring of enlightenment and wisdom and experience all kinds of positive changes, a process that we call human revolution these days. It's an inner transformation, developing the confidence that we can change anything, any negativity, any sufferings into something of value in our lives, which I think was so beautifully illustrated by that clip. So anyway, that's the type of chanting that we heard Tina doing in the sequence. And as she describes in the book as well as in the film, she found this practice, you know, when she was, as was kind of alluded to at the beginning of that clip, when she was at a really terrible spot in her life. You know, she was trapped in this horrible environment with her first husband, Ike, very abusive and extremely unhealthy, to put it mildly. And she was really desperate for change. And at first, actually, as she describes in Happiness Becomes You, a sound engineer at that studio she was talking about mentioned chanting to her, and she was like, you know, I think he was kind of a hippie kind of guy, and she's like, she thought it was for young, you know, college students and not for some 30 something mother of 4, you know, like herself. So she just kind of brushed it off. And then the next person who came along was her youngest son, Ronnie, actually came home one day and started telling her about chanting, because one of his classmates up the street from where they lived, their family were Sgi Buddhists, and they had chanting meetings at their house. And so he actually encouraged his mother, Tina, to go and learn more about it. But you know, in those days, she was basically a prisoner, you know, in her own home. And so something as simple as just going up the street, she couldn't even do that. So that kind of fell by the wayside. And then the third person who came along was Valerie, who we just saw in the clip there. And she also happened to work at the studio, so that was very convenient, because then, you know, when Tina was ready to receive the message, she didn't have to go anywhere. You know, she didn't have to sneak away from home or anything. She could actually quietly learn that way. And so the third time was the charm. And soon Tina started learning that there were these neighborhood chanting meetings that Ronnie had told her about. They were organized actually all over the world, but also there in West LA in Brentwood, where she started practicing. And the SGI these days is in 192 countries or something like that. It's basically in every country in the entire world, where they have these neighborhood chanting meetings, and that's what Tina describes in the book as finding her sacred space. You know, her community of spirit, she calls it, and that's where Tina first learned about the concepts of changing poison into medicine and human revolution, and the other core concepts that we explored through Tina's life in Happiness Becomes You, and that's kind of what she was talking about there in that clip as well.
Awesome. And so for
Taro, I love that we heard so many different origin stories of how Tina was introduced to Buddhism. And, you know, the one that was the most frequent was Valerie Bishop, but even Tina will have these kind of hazy memories of talking about, like, I think when my son showed up with prayer beads. But I love that in your book, you're like, because we always assumed it was like, well, you know, what's probably the truth is a little bit of all of it.
Everything, yeah.
And I love that, yeah, in your book, you're like, actually, here's, you know, it is a little bit of everything, and here's this order of events.
Yes.
Which is always kind of the case, right?
Yeah.
Well, so that's something I wanted to ask about, you know, for Dan and TJ, you know, for both of you. How did you prepare for capturing Tina's Buddhist practice in the doc? Did you read about her practice of Buddhism and maybe Buddhism more broadly? Did you or anyone involved in the documentary meet, you know, with Sgi members, or, you know?
Well, I mean, Taro was a big resource for us. In fact, you know, before we got on here, I had missed the one meeting because there was a fire threatening my house, but TJ and our co-producer, Ben Piner, who's a kind of a jack of all trades for us in terms of archive and research, you know, along with TJ and I dove in to that. But I mean, again, Taro was a massive resource for us to be able to send, you know, we sent the film to him so he could look at it and make sure we were getting things correctly. And because there's obviously a lot of nuance that there was just no way we were going to, amidst trying to also tell the story of her life, we get everything right over the course of 2 years. So yeah, it was diving into that, but also just, you know, we had the luxury of these tapes, of these interviews that Tina did both in 1981 with Carl Arrington, which is what you're hearing there, the profile she did in People magazine. And this was the first time that she publicly spoke about kind of the truth of her relationship with Ike. And then we also had the tapes from Kurt Loder that he did, the numerous conversations and interviews he did with Tina over the course of writing the book, I, Tina. And so, you know, it was really beneficial for us to be able to just kind of, in some ways, be a fly on the wall and listen to these old interviews where she is in that kind of present time describing what it meant to her right then. And so yeah, it was a process of, you know, kind of primary resources, our own research, talking to people like Taro, and just speaking with Tina herself. You know, that was something that was really important to her when we first sat down with her, was to make sure that the film really addressed her spirituality. And in fact, again, as we'll probably say continuously throughout this conversation, in the idea of there could be a 10-part series, you could make a film just about that aspect of Tina's life and the importance it has had, especially in the second half of her life and a lot of the decisions she's made.
And so those audios we heard of Tina chanting and that kind of montage, that's all from that Arrington tape.
Everything, the actual chant, while she did chant for Carl, the one you actually hear there is what she was doing for Kurt, and that was simply because it was a cleaner audio. So we kind of spliced that part in for when she actually does the chanting.
Oh, I see. And so something I wanted to specifically ask about, you know, this concept of changing poison into medicine, and which Taro, you know, you mentioned, and that's kind of a theme of her life. And I was fortunate enough to attend the Broadway opening of Tina the musical. It was amazing. Tina looked amazing, all the good stuff. But on stage, she shared that in her view, her life was like poison that turned into medicine. And she kind of shared that at each of the musical openings that she attended. And that also forms the subject of chapter 5, right, of the book, Happiness Becomes You. So Taro, can you say something about, can you explain this concept, its background, its meaning for Tina?
Yes, sure. Yeah, as you said, changing poison into medicine is truly what Tina sees as the theme of her life. You know, as you said, she mentions it at all the different musical openings around the world. She mentioned it when we were there in New York. So for those who aren't familiar, it's a concept that goes way back to a Buddhist scholar named Nagarjuna in the year 200, who said that the wisdom of the Lotus Sutra is like a skilled physician who can change poison into medicine. And so basically, to put it simply, it's a very optimistic, empowering concept that tells us that problems are unavoidable in life. You know, everybody, we all have problems. And when we do face challenges and obstacles, instead of running away from them or denying them or complaining about them, we can actually use them as opportunities to create even greater happiness and stability than before they arose. And in the chapters you mentioned, changing poison into medicine in Happiness Becomes You, there's a part I really love where Tina says that the obstacles we face hold the lessons we need to learn to make our dreams come true. Something to that effect, which I think is so beautiful. So that's that attitude. Not only does Tina embody that attitude so beautifully and powerfully, but that's the essence of changing poison into medicine. That's what it really means in a nutshell. And the key to that is life force. You know, to expand our hearts and minds bigger and greater, so that we're stronger than any problems that come about, so that we can see things clearly. Again, which is, you know, what Tina was kind of alluding to in that little clip that you showed. Because, you know, as I think TJ was mentioning, Tina seems like this superhero. She has this incredible superhero persona, but she's a human, right? She's just like all of us. And so when things happen, you know, it's normal to kind of feel upset or sad or whatever. But this concept of changing poison into medicine tells us that if you have those reactions, that's fine, but you got to snap out of it as fast as you can and face it and not run away from it, and look for the opportunity, look for the value in the challenge, whatever that may be. And for Tina and for Buddhists, that the way that can be done is through chanting Nam-myoho Renge Kyo. That's the whole process of that transformation, is manifesting that wisdom and that life force to be able to change those things and see the value and see what you have to learn to get through it and to flip it. You know, one of my favorite concepts that Tina talks about in the book is that as bad as it is exactly how great it can be when you do change the poison into medicine. Does that make sense?
Yes.
And we all have that ability. We can't be Tina Turner maybe, but we can be our own superheroes.
Wouldn't we be so lucky? For Dan and TJ, right? I mean, much of the poison that Tina speaks of, right, is in some way, in significant ways, her relationship with Ike Turner, right? And all that happened over the course of 16 years or so. And so with this in mind, you know, can you tell us about the decision to substantially center the documentary around Tina's relationship with Ike and then her 80s success?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if it's the film is centered around her relationship with Ike, but rather her relationship with her story. I think the way we, you know, one of the revelations that we had in the early meetings we had with Tina is, and you know, in retrospect, we recognize it shouldn't have been a revelation, was this notion that even at this chapter in her life, she's still wrestling, and I shouldn't say wrestling, processing the past. You know, she shared with us that it's not that, and this isn't exactly how she shared it, but this is kind of what we extrapolated, is that it's not necessarily that in talking, she can't talk about Ike or talk about the bad times or talk about the suffering. Everything's on the table with her, which is very true. I mean, she's very open about her life. It's just she's very cognizant of the fact that there are consequences that come along with it. So if she spends too much time, you know, stewing and living in the past or talking about the past, she says Ike comes back to her in nightmares, and it feels as if, you know, it was yesterday. you know, that he was in her life, and she's kind of navigating honestly the PTSD of it all. And so that is the thing that we really latched onto. And in kind of diving into that, we realized that part of the thing that makes her not be able to escape it is the fact that her narrative is out in the world, and she's always forced to reckon with it as a result of her popularity and the love and the adoration that she has from the public.
Mm-hmm.
So we kind of actually thought about the film more about, well, you know, the tension really lies between Tina and the story of Tina, because that's the thing. She can't seem to change that narrative. It's kind of solidified itself in the public eye. And that's, so we thought of Tina, like, what's as one character in the story, Tina another. So you're kind of getting the origin story of both, and then eventually they cross and they meet each other in the film. And you know, the irony of all of this is that the origin story of the story of Tina is completely her own doing. You know, for those that don't know, the intent was, after leaving Ike and going on her own as a solo artist, everybody in the business in the music industry associated her with Ike, and Ike didn't have a great reputation, so she had to figure out a way to separate herself and to be seen as a solo artist. And so one way she thought of doing that, obviously in conversations with her manager, Roger Davies, was, what if I went public with the narrative, with my experience, my personal experience of what it was like living with Ike Turner, to really to separate myself from this individual and be seen as my own voice and it wasn't from what we can gather, it wasn't an intent to gain empathy, but an intent to say, I'm my own woman. And in doing so, I don't think she expected people to really latch on to that narrative. And then that was the beginning of, you know, then a book, then a movie, then a musical. Never kind of escaped this one aspect of her story, and that didn't necessarily allow herself, that got solidified to the point where it didn't allow her to grow with it. It kind of kept pulling her back to the past. So yeah, we thought of the film as really, that's the central tension, is her relationship with the story, not necessarily her relationship with Ike. It's just the story itself is steeped in trauma. So it just kind of keeps coming back. She's kind of had to figure out a way to navigate that.
I feel that with that background, you know, with that context for how you went about making the film, then it becomes clear to me why, you know, in some of the interviews that Tina gave around the book, Happiness Becomes You, right, she says that the book is in some ways like a companion piece to the documentary. And I think in some ways in the book, she kind of addresses another side of that kind of trauma, right? How she kind of comes to terms with aspects of that in, right, book form here in Happiness Becomes You. Would you agree with that, Taro?
Absolutely. And I think, you know, one of the most profound moments we had, it was really toward the end of making the book, was the part in the final chapter, Homecoming, about forgiveness. You know, saying that she finally forgave Ike. That was so profound because, as TJ was saying, there's this narrative that, you know, it's kind of synonymous with her name, but it also never includes the forgiveness. You know, it never includes resolution. And so if the public's constantly just harping on that one piece, like TJ said, without the full picture, and without accepting that Tina has, you know, come full circle with those things, then she's just constantly reminded of just all the horrible stuff, right? And so that part about forgiveness and finally just putting it out there and saying, you know, and also acknowledging that a lot of people don't like to hear that, because maybe they think it's like you're condoning some sort of bad behavior that somebody, you know, perpetrated against you, and that's not the case at all. She makes it very clear that the forgiveness is all about yourself, you know, about letting go, breaking those chains, and setting yourself free, and as TJ said, becoming, you know, an individual that's separate from that whole narrative, and also, you know, it was just a piece of a huge life, right? It's just this one little piece of this enormous grand life, and so I think that that's also very important, and that's also in the book. So yeah, all those topics are covered in Happiness Becomes You. And I think for me, observing that, that was kind of the most healing thing for me, was to see that this also, it becomes, you know, full circle with the forgiveness. And, you know, I thought it was so profound when we were all there on opening night on Broadway. I don't know if you guys were around when Tina mentioned this, but she was saying how she wished, she was naming people she wished had been there, and the first person she said was Ike. So she said, I wish Ike and Eileen and my mom or everybody was here to see this. I thought that was so beautiful, you know, because that really showed that she's let it go. You know, for her, it's gone, and it's just everybody else that's just kind of latching on to everything. And so to me, that really was also a signal of how deep that healing now is being processed. That she could have nothing but happy feelings, you know, even seeing what's shown in the musical, which is the whole story, right? So that was really profound for me too.
I think I would just add too to what's being discussed here is, especially in the film, I mean, we were also moving towards a destination in some ways in terms of narrative of like, one of the things that became very evident to us in talking with Tina and then in doing the interview is the pain of her abandonment as a child, and how that influence and still continues to you know, impact her today in many ways, and impacted I would assume the forming of her personality. And so I think, you know, to understand her journey, you have to go through the years with Ike. But in many ways in our narrative, we were trying to get to the place that, like, to really understand a lot of this, you also have to understand where she comes from, and you know, and this longing that even nearing 80 years old when we were doing the interview, you could sense to me, it's the most palpable part of the interview we did with her, is her longing for this love that she wanted from her mother that she never felt she received. And that clearly, I think, hopefully, that we kind of demonstrate in some ways in the film, the impacts that had on her journey through life.
I think one of the things to me that's interesting as well is that, right, she has this personal kind of story of, you know, the kind of childhood and Ike and the success and the career and all of that. But then she's also facing, right, racism. She's also facing sexism, right, ageism. I think Lotus says in the documentary, right, she's older than your average pop star when she's talking about making a comeback. You know, she's in cabaret clubs telling Roger that she wants to be in stadiums, and he's like, all right, I guess. Right, so she's navigating a number of things. And yet the documentary shows, right, the book showed her struggle to tell her story in ways authentic to herself. And so how did, and this is for all three of you, how did you navigate working with Tina for both the book and the documentary to discuss these sensitive subjects? I think Katori Hall, who was one of the writers, or the writer for Tina the Musical, I think in the documentary she says, or in an interview or something, she says one day that Tina told her things that you would only tell, you know, in your most intimate moments, right? And so, right, some really horrible things that she was navigating. So how did you all navigate discussing these kinds of sensitive issues with her, for someone for whom that those traumas are present in some ways?
Yeah, I mean, you know, there's once again, there's another film to be made that's just about her pioneering and kind of breaking down social barriers. I actually think the bigger challenge is that Tina, well, two things, right? Tina's not necessarily a sociologist, so I wouldn't say she has her own perspective and her own views of kind of the systems and how she actually navigated them. So it wasn't really our place to put the burden on her to explain racism in the music industry, which is really just a reflection of racism in our country. And same goes with ageism, same goes with sexism. However, it was important for us to understand just her personal ideologies on it. So for us, again, like I said before, nothing was really off the table for Tina. It was just, we had to figure out a way to set context so the audience could understand the challenges, and then go back into the POV of the film, which is very much the POV of Tina. As she says, you know, there's a moment in the film where you know, we were fortunate to get this tape from John Carter, who's an executive at Capitol, who kind of shared this anecdote about what the inner workings were like with the higher ups there, and that they were kind of shocked that he had signed and wanted to work with Tina Turner at the time, and they essentially called her, dropped the N-bomb, and said that she was kind of, you know, worthless. She was a has-been. And at that point, our job is, like, that's setting the context. At that point, our job is to understand Tina's POV, which is, and we've already kind of understood, she's discovered her spirituality, and we understand that she practices Buddhism faithfully, no pun intended, and to get that insight from her, that essentially is, and it's funny because in certain circles you could say it's a cop-out, but really it's very true to Tina. She's like, I didn't sit and marinate and stew on that. I stewed and I marinated on the things that I can control, you know? And this is coming from someone who has got a crazy work ethic. So why not put that energy, knowing that she has that work ethic, into the things that she knows, the places that she wants to be, and the things that she can actually control. And that, at least from our time spent with her, that is a consistent ideology of her. So because that's the case, it would be irresponsible of us to try to force upon a different narrative within the context of the film, because we're trying to say, here's an opportunity for us as filmmakers to really just be a conduit for Tina to express her own voice. So that's how we navigated a lot of that stuff. Because to your point, like, you could stop down, I mean, her career spanned 6 decades. You could stop down in any one of those decades and explore how violently racist the times were. But again, that's not what the film's about. The film is actually through the lens of Tina Turner. So it was about actually navigating it, and the ideology behind navigating it, and how do you survive, essentially.
Yeah, and you know, she talks about that in Happiness Becomes You as well. And I think that what becomes very clear is that she never limited or defined herself by any of those labels, any of those isms. Is other people always, you know, putting the labels on her. And you know, if somebody told her she's too old, someone told her Black women, you know, can't be rock and roll stars and fill stadiums, she was just like, her attitude was, all right, let me show these folks how it's done, you know. She's got to work, you know. And she broke through all those barriers, all the isms, better than anybody, I think, that's ever done, in many ways, especially in the rock industry. And I think fundamentally, like she talks about in the book as well, she sees herself and everybody in humanity as one people, you know, one global family without any labels. So that's part of it. I think that's also part of why she was able to just, you know, shake that stuff off, because that's not her identity. That's someone else's issue, not hers. And she just got to work and did what had to be done to prove them wrong.
I mean, that same line of thinking also kind of, I wouldn't say it worked against her, but it kind of goes back to this notion that I think people have imposed ideas about her, right? She's navigated the world primarily as a means of trying to figure out how to live a healthy life. And in her case, a lot of times it was just purely survival. And her actions, I think, made it seem as though she is an activist, a feminist, and I'm sure she embodies some of those ideologies, but she's not the person to stand on that pedestal. But because of her actions, we as a public, again, kind of started identifying her in this certain way. Well, she must be this, she must be that. And that's what's so interesting about Tina Turner is like, the more you try to identify her, actually the further away you are from who she actually is. She really carved out her own voice. And I think that was something that was really important for us in making the film was again, like, how much heavy lifting can we do as filmmakers to kind of create the framework, but the film should be an opportunity for her to self-identify as much as possible. And she's wholly unique in that way.
Mm-hmm. And to breaking, I mean, I think to breaking through some of those isms, as Taro said, right? I love in the film, right? There's this footage from the Rio concert, right? When she's singing, "I Can't Stand the Rain." But I think one of the things that's so amazing to me about that concert is in the kind of full concert, in the full video, there's a moment where she stops and she says, you know, "I had a wish, and my wish was to fill a football stadium. And now I feel the biggest football stadium in the world," right? And she had something like 180,000+ people there, right? So I think that determination to keep going, I think, would cause people to put, you know, things on you to see themselves in that story. And I think something I'd like to turn to now is a bit of the relationship between Buddhism and the arts. So I want to read a quote to you. In a 2018 interview in Living Buddhism magazine, Tina said the following: "I have never separated my spiritual practice from my life as a rock singer. When I was going through the hardest times of my life, I was chanting Nam Myoho Renge Kyo. Chanting helped me and changed my life for the better. I've left a good body of work as a rock singer, and I've made it very clear that it was because of my spiritual practice." So while, end quote, so while she has explored the connection between, you know, her spiritual life and her career, most recently in Happiness Becomes You, in some ways, right, Tina has made statements to this effect in a variety of media over the years. And so, Taro, you know, what can you tell us about the connection between Tina as a rock artist and her spiritual practice? Is Tina's understanding here unique, or are her views common within the Sgi? If so, what accounts for such a view?
Yeah, she said in that interview in 2018, by the way, I'm the one that did that interview.
Oh, good. You're the person to ask me.
She really does see her professional life as an expression, I think, of her spirituality, of her heart, you know, and in the sense that her intention for her work is the same as her intention in any part of her life, which is to inspire people, to create good, you know, to spread joy, positivity, all those things. And I think we can see that, you know, in all of her, everything she does, all of her performances are like that, including the one you're talking about in Rio, which, by the way, was a world record. So yeah, as she says in Happiness Becomes You, I think, you know, this beautiful story about how she used to chant for an hour before every concert for the true happiness of her audience. You know, that's just so that's so profound and so rare, you know, I would assume. I found that so beautiful, that kind of merging of the two, of the spiritual aspect with her work. And as to your question about the Sgi Buddhist community, yeah, I think that's a common thing for Sgi Buddhists, to be mindful of one's behavior, mindful of your thoughts, words, and deeds. You know, whether it's work or any aspect of your life, you know, there's not really any separation, because fundamentally Buddhism is about cause and effect, right? So those are all causes that you're making to create the effects that you want. And particularly back in, you know, in the days in the 70s and 80s, when she was really trying to break through all those obstacles we've been talking about, you know, in those days she didn't even have a place to live. She was staying with Anna and Wayne Shorter in those days and chanting 4 hours a day, and, you know, doing all these rehearsals and preparations and study and everything, you know, to make her dreams come true. And I think, you know, sometimes when people hear that, or when they read it in Happiness Becomes You, it's kind of like, oh my God, like how could anybody do, how could you chant 4 hours a day? But for Tina, or like her work ethic, like TJ's talking about, she has work ethic like nobody. But for her, it was a joy. This was how she was breaking through. This is how she was making her dreams come true. It gave her energy. Being in rhythm that way with 4 hours of chanting, what she calls being in rhythm with the universe, was easy, for her especially in those days. Because if you think about where she was starting, her starting point, and where her dreams were, it's like, like she talks about in the book, it was literally like she was trying to become the first woman in space, propelling herself into space with her own energy, and that's what it took. And so anyhow, I do think that whether it's in her personal life or work or whatever it may be, to her there's no separation between her Buddhist principles or Buddhist faith and everything else she does in life.
Mm-hmm. Dan, I saw you nod.
I'm just part of the audience listening to the knowledge.
Oh, no, I think, right, this is captured so well, I think, in the documentary, that intensity, right, that determination, the kind of the sweating and the, you can kind of see in these performances dripping sweat, and she's in rehearsals. And I think she has a moment in the documentary where she says, so I went to work and I had to work. And there was an interview I saw once where she was asked kind of incredulously, like, you were a maid when you left Ike and you had nowhere to live and you were a maid and cleaning up for people. And like, wasn't that terrible? And she said, well, no, actually, it was great. And I was cleaning and arranging these houses, and it was what I would do in my own house, except my own house was missing, right? So that kind of, that same determination, I think, to make things happen seems to be the same determination depicted in the film on stage. It seems to be the same determination that gets you to sit 4 hours a day and chant and these kinds of things. And I think for Dan and TJ, I wonder what, it seems that a big aspect of the documentary must have been the question of how to communicate Tina's spirituality through the film medium, right? It's not a documentary about Buddhism per se, right? Nor is it a documentary about music per se. So, right, so each of these decisions that you all made are that decisions. So how did you go about deciding how to depict Tina's spirituality in the film? What was important to you about that?
It's funny, I don't think anybody's ever asked us in that kind of direct way. And I don't know that we ever had a specific discussion of like, okay, how are we going to do this? I think, as storytellers, a lot of times we're going on instinct. But I do think part of it was, as filmmakers, TJ and I always want to make films that are experiential. And that's a difficult thing oftentimes, especially in nonfiction, because a lot of times you're talking about events or people in retrospect. And so there's a lot of like, it's not as, to us as filmmakers, that's not as engaging as, can I put an audience in the experience? And so for us, it's like, how can we put people in the journey of Tina Turner so that the audience is discovering that spirituality at the same time that she is? And so I don't know that we had a specific, okay, this is how we're going to do it. We just knew that we wanted the narrative to bring you to the place where she is at that point in her life where she is looking for something. And this thing comes along that ends up being the thing that gives her the strength, or at least, that she attributes to giving her the strength to leave the situation she was in. And I think for us, it was then about creating a sequence that would, again, be experiential. And I'm glad that both of you talked about how much you like that sequence in the film and it resonates with you. And that was a big deal for us because we wanted it to carry then with you throughout the rest of the film, so that as she is making these decisions, that is in you, right? We don't need to then have some talking head go, well, what you have to remember is Tina discovered, it's just there. And so when even in the choices of when Roger sees Tina for the first time, right? And we go and we take the performance and it kind of deconstructs into this kind of dreamlike thing where Roger is suddenly, now he's not watching just a cabaret performer on stage, he's watching something else. And that again it's not directly about the spirituality, but it is hopefully reminding you of that in a very subtextual way, like this journey that she is on and this power that she has found from this. I don't know if that answers the question or not, but because it's a hard thing. We never sit there and say like, okay, now how are we going to do this? It's about a kind of process of building and again, always trying to keep the audience engaged in an experiential way.
When I think of, oh, sorry.
I think oh no, I was going to say, I think probably the biggest thing is, to Dan's point, is it's about creating an immersive space so that once you go through that plot point, you feel it and you always carry it with you, to Dan's point, like in the subtext moving forward. But I always because we're working in the context of, we're conscious of the content, the medium that we're working with, and we're conscious of that context. So I always thought of it as part of the same way that River Deep Mountain High gave her a taste of freedom. You should not ever let go of that plot point in her life. That leads to the next major thing, which leads to the next, the same way that like she discovers spirituality, she leaves Ike, they get a divorce, she reappropriates her name. By the time you're at the end of the film, you are still, the feeling that you're having is a result of still remembering and feeling the sense that she has taken the name Tina Turner and took it to a whole other place. So I saw spirituality in her her practice kind of in that same light. And on a practical note, I think at least for me, I always had to remind myself that, like, because there's so many moments where you can kind of bring it back into play and like have it motivate a character's decision or something like that. But I always thought of it like a more dominant example would be like movies about, people that are like born again or something like that. Like once they're born again Christians, and then the film becomes about faith. And we had to keep reminding ourselves that our film's not about faith. That's not what it's about. But it is a fundamental aspect of who she has become. And so to Dan's point, it's a major plot point. You can't deny it because it does shape her view on the world. And at that point, it should be a part of the fabric of the film. And it should be a part of the subtext of the film, but it's not necessarily the film. And it was always like pulling back when needed, or using, to Dan's earlier point, using film techniques to kind of allude to it. Audio dips out, then it's just, a musical bed or something like that. And you're seeing her in a certain light and just hinting towards it, trying to keep a deft touch along the way.
So I want to turn now to some of the audience questions. And again, if you have questions, you can use the Q&A function. But one question that seems to tie well into this is, did the pandemic affect the amount of material you wanted to use or limited you in any way? And I would add to that and specifically ask, are there more chanting sequences that were on the cutting? Is there more altar footage that was on the cutting board?
I mean, practically speaking, the pandemic affected us in terms of some of the, for lack of a better term, like B-roll scenes where we're, the stuff in Nutbush is actually in Nutbush, but some of the stuff we had to actually create in LA because we couldn't travel to those actual places. So like the hotel, for instance, when she leaves, like the intention was to always go to the Statler Hotel in Dallas, where she actually escaped from and film that there. And it was just not practically possible. And, that was a frustration for us as filmmakers. but you know, it suffices, I guess, what we have there. But yeah, I mean, there's that. There was it was just you know, on a kind of psychological level, it was really difficult. We were reaching the part where we really needed to be kind of picking up momentum in the edit right as that happened. And you know, I think there was, I don't want to go off into a revisiting like last March, but it was a really difficult time, because I think, you know, the people that we were working with to make the film, nobody knew what was going to happen. And there's this desire to keep things moving forward instead of all of us just stopping for a second. I mean, me and TJ did this with our team, just stopping for a second and being like, this is crazy. And like, things aren't going to continue the way that we thought they were. And so, yeah, I think I definitely think for several weeks on a kind of psychological level, it really impacted us more than we probably ever expressly talked about with each other. It was a very, very difficult. It was also, again, it was strangely a nice distraction in some ways. Like I think we had a very different experience than a lot of people, because we had something we were really focused on.
I feel it was very cathartic for you to say that. Were you about to say something?
No, I mean, I think you already talked about it though, Dan. I think that's when my screen froze up. The not being able to screen the film for audiences that's a fundamental part of filmmaking, is to, even if it's gonna not go to theaters, and it's, you know, it's gonna stream on a platform, to be able to watch a film with a group of people is just like, that's the little like elusive part of filmmaking, that you start to see the blind spots that you've been so, you know, you've gotten so acclimated to the film, you're so deep in it that you lose sight of the bigger picture. And so to be able to sit with a group of folks or an audience is like crucial to the kind of the last stage of crafting your film. And we just never got that opportunity because of COVID and because of the quarantine. And so I think you were talking about this earlier, Dan, like saying we're done with it was kind of like, I guess we're done with it. We'll see what happens when this gets released in the digital verse, and we'll see how people react to it. So
the powers that be eventually told us we were done with it.
Yeah,
we'd still be working on it.
That's okay. And so for Taro, you know, same question, you know, that because Happiness Becomes You came out in December 2020, right? So in the midst of the pandemic as well, were things left on the chopping board? Are there more photos of Tina at the altar?
There may be, yes. Well, actually, in our case, we had pretty much wrapped up most of the book by the time the pandemic started. You know, the heart of it, the biggest chunks of it were already complete. And so then we just had to switch from, instead of me, you know, going over there to Zurich and regularly, you know, we just switched to email, tons of emails, and, you know, texting and so forth, phone calls. So actually, fortunately, it wasn't a huge issue for us. And, you know, and obviously writing is so much different than filmmaking, as the guys are saying, you know, because we're just dealing with drafts that we can send back and forth anyway. You don't really have to be there in person. Of course, it was nice when we could be, but it wasn't necessary. So it didn't really have much of a negative effect. The only major issue was it did have a large effect on the international publishers. And so that's why a lot of the international versions that are you would have typically come out at the same time as the English one have not yet come out. I think 4 or 5 countries have come out so far. Just today I heard that next month is Italy and Greece and Turkey, and we've got, I think, maybe a dozen more coming in the fall. So that's logistically, that was one of the main things that the pandemic had on the book.
This isn't necessarily to actually answer your question in terms of whether the pandemic affected certain bits of like content, and specifically you asked about, you know, other aspects of her practice. though there is one thing and it wasn't affected by the pandemic. It's just, it's just the process of filmmaking. You have to divorce yourself from stuff that you really love. Like we said, nothing is off the table with Tina. And we did spend quite a bit of time talking about some of some of her health issues in the last 4 or 5 years. But that led to I thought a really interesting conversation about her outlook on death and how much she really embraces it. Not just embraces it, but kind of like is at such peace with it, and how much she actually is so genuinely excited to look forward to what that other chapter in looks like, and what that will be. And she actually like illuminates when she lights up quite a bit when you start talking about the next realm. That again, I thought that was for those who have a certain who've kind of position Tina in their own POV being a certain way. I thought that was a nice, refreshing opportunity to kind of see that it felt like it almost went beyond her spirituality. Like, this as an individual is so interested and so attracted to so many things that go beyond the realm of our universe. It was just, it felt like it was that we were getting a true sense of Tina the person, or the being. It would have been nice to be able to incorporate some elements of that, but just again, it didn't quite fit within the confines of the story.
I'm hearing some outtakes for the for the DVD that's coming. It reminds me of a book called Unlocking the Mysteries of Birth and Death by Daisaku Ikeda. It kind of that outlook, right? That perspective of kind of looking beyond, using this life as a platform to look beyond. Kind of reminds me a bit of that. Would you agree, Taro? I see you nodding.
Absolutely, yeah. It's everything that TJ just described is a very Buddhist outlook, that Tina has on life and death and the eternity of life. And there's a great analogy in Buddhism of death being like a sleep, sleeping and waking, birth and death. It's a similar kind of cycle. And so Tina has no fear of death, just like she has no fear in life. And that's part of the beauty of her wisdom and her strength, is that she's okay with anything. Yeah, and happy no matter what.
I think one question that has been asked, right, and I think both TJ and Dan, you've kind of touched on this a little bit, so maybe you can expand upon it. But the film has a certain trajectory, right? And so then her kind of later years, from say the mid-90s on, right? There's a little bit of What's Love Got to Do It in the film, so that's like 93 or so. But from that point on, right? Not so much in the documentary. And so what influenced that?
I mean, basically not diving into kind of her, let's say, wildest dreams kind of in through retirement. I think, or I guess even Foreign Affair. I mean, there is that stuff is visually addressed in ways, but I think a lot of that is just that if we were, again, someone definitely needs to make the film that is just like, let's dive into Tina purely as a kind of performing artist and look at how she has influenced music in that way. And I think then in that narrative, that would be something that would need to be covered. I think once, in just terms of storytelling, once she kind of broke free and kind of achieved the success of her career, for us in the narrative, it was then, because most of the stories of Tina end there. And what we were interested in is, okay, what happens to the woman not on stage once that success happens. It turns out that actually didn't cure all of of everything, right? Which again, a lot of tellings of her story tend to end with her with "What's Love Got to Do with It," the song coming out, and then that's everything's fine, right? You got a #1 hit. But our intention was to always get to eventually the Tina that is going to attend the Broadway premiere, and what she was dealing with in those times on a personal level. So that's really the only reason. I mean, we did have cuts of scenes and sequences where we got into all that stuff. There was a lot of behind the scenes from, I'm trying to remember what video it was in Cape Town that they were filming while she was there doing a tour in South Africa. And but yeah, ultimately it just didn't fit the kind of narrative we were telling.
I see. Well, so that brings me to this. So there's a question in the chat, right? This is the most poignant moment in the film for me was showing Tina's struggle with bowing out, given the tremendous amount of love and adoration her fans have for her. It felt like a lot was left unsaid in that moment. How did you experience that moment with her? And what are your thoughts of how she is with this process of leaving the Tina Turner icon part of her life? And I think I would add to that question by asking, in a sense, is this really the end? There's this moment in the documentary and Erwin says, we're wrapping it up, you're going to America and you're saying goodbye. But in some ways, Tina's been saying goodbye for a long time. Every tour was a farewell tour, basically. So is this really the end? And if it is, then why? So I guess it's like a 4-part question. But if it is the end, why? She gets emotional at the end of the film when she says, how do I bow out gracefully? If it's really the end and that's settled, why is it such an emotional moment for her in your perspective?
I mean, I feel like we lost TJ, but
My back.
I think it's an emotional moment. It's also, I think what you're seeing there is, from my vantage point, is also a bit of frustration on her end. I think, Tina, look, only she can answer that question of, is this the end or not? I have no idea. My sense is, from the time I've spent with her, is she's very happy right now. And I think she, she was a performer for, as TJ mentioned earlier, 6 decades of her life. I mean, from the moment, I've said this several times, it's always astonishes me. The first band Tina Turner ever saw was Ike Turner and the Kings of Rhythm. That's the first time she ever saw a band on a stage with instruments playing. And she joined that band and then worked for the rest of her life as a performer. Yeah. And she got to the point where I think she is very happy to be away from the stage. And I think when she says how do you bow out? We are registering that moment in the film, and I think it's our own personal interpretation of it, is that's very much about, like, how do I bow out from being Tina Turner, the icon? She's I think has a desire in her life to just be Tina Turner the person, and to live her life in a quiet life that she truly enjoys, gardening and decorating her house and having quiet and waking up late and not having to do all of these things. So I don't know if that answers the question or not, but I'm sure, Taro, you probably have insights on that from spending time with her as well.
Yeah, simply put, I would say yes, this is really it. Because, as we've been saying, she's been working, almost her entire life. And as the guys put in the film so beautifully, there's this, the world has Tina Turner, but then she's anime, right, at home, and it's time for anime to have anime, and Urban to be with anime and the private Tina. And I think what I captured, I was also very moved by that moment in the film, because it reminded me of, even when we started working on the book, it was very clear that, the film, the book, the musical, that's it. We're done. And it wasn't clear then exactly, is the book going to be the last thing? Is the film going to be the last thing? What's coming last? But it was clear that this is the end. But as Dan said, it's Tina Turner, you never know. And as you said, Ralph, it's true. I think when we were doing some research for the book, I discovered that fact, that I think it was starting in '93, maybe every tour was kind of billed as a farewell tour. So who knows? Of course, and she I think she's got a lot left in her to give to the world if she ever decides to do that. But my impression is that yes, this Happiness Becomes You, Tina the film, the musical, is truly her final gifts to the world, so that she can now retire in peace and enjoy. She's really happy, as Dan said, she's extremely happy living her private life and not having to have a schedule and not having to worry about the public and interacting with folks in a public, in a Tina Turner way. She could just be a civilian, so to speak. Yeah, so I think I do think it's retirement time.
That was in, when we attended the musical with her, it's not featured in the film, but she and Erwin arrived a few days early and stayed with a friend in upstate, and we hung out with them for a couple of days and filmed around with them and did some interviews with her, and it was the first time everything she had talked about kind of in terms of her relationship with the persona of Tina Turner, and seeing not just stage life as work, but embodying this persona is exhausting, and it's work, because she has to she can probably feel the perception of who people think she is, which is not necessarily accurate to who she is. So that's got to be exhausting to always be navigating that space. But it was the first time where everything she had kind of talked about in that sense was really palpable. In some of the interviews we did with her when she was getting ready to attend the premiere of the musical, she was just kind of deeply honored, but she was like, I don't want to do this. It was just coming back to a place where I think she felt like she just kind of already moved on, emotionally, spiritually, intellectually. She was kind of, she wants to hang in her backyard and at the castle by the lake. That's where she's at. That's the chapter she's in. So why force yourself into another space? Yeah.
So then did Tina have any reaction to the film and the book, right? If this is the end and she was to put it out there and kind of walk away from Tina, right, as persona, but here there is a book, right, and that has to be promoted. There's a documentary and all of this. So seeing it, what has been the response from Tina, to the success of the documentary and the book, but also some of the feedback that you've heard about these projects from others. This is for all of you.
Well, I know that she's extremely happy, extremely proud. As I said, and as she says in the book, this is her ultimate gift. Her spirituality, she feels, was her ultimate gift to the world. And she's been waiting to deliver it for 30 some years, whenever she first started talking about writing a book like this. And, I've seen the reaction of so many people, both to the book and the film, and it's been overwhelmingly positive all around the world. So yeah, I think that there couldn't possibly be a better way for Tina to now truly move into that space that TJ's talking about than to have these final diamonds on top of her, crown. And of course, we haven't even mentioned that what was it, last week? She's being inducted into, it was announced she's being inducted to the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, finally, as an individual artist. So that's, that's just another gem in the crown. So what's not to be happy about, right?
Yeah, she was definitely happy with the film, but it was a nerve-wracking thing for us because, where Taro is working with her in conjunction on the book, we kind of did our interview with her and we filmed obviously more with her, but it's not like we were showing her cuts of the film or anything. And so we finished the film and for anyone who has seen the film, you can see that there's a kind of inherent contradiction in the fact that we are exploring the story that we know is very traumatic for her. And so there was a lot of discussion with Erwin about how we would do that. Should we, so we showed Erwin first to get his read on how do we do this? We're just very concerned that we didn't want to do the thing that, some other people have done and contribute to re-traumatizing her in any way. And so, but ultimately she decided, no, I want to see the whole thing. And there was a screening set up. And because of this was during COVID, TJ and it was when she watched it and finished it to get on Zoom, it was like 3:30 in the morning or something, our time, or 4 in the morning. So our producer in London, Simon, got on Zoom with her and Erwin afterwards. And Simon reported back to us that the screen popped on and she was smiling really big. And she was like, I love it. She was, the thing that was really refreshing for us is that she said that we got it right, that, she was like, I remember all of it. And there was a lot of things that she just hadn't seen in so long and that she was reminded of, but she said, that was my experience. And so that was really gratifying as filmmakers. TJ, I feel like you're
Were you about to say something, TJ?
No.
Yeah.
I think Tina happy, we're all happy.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
I think the final thing that I'd like to ask, if for Taro and for Dan and TJ also weigh in, right? That kind of concept that hangs over all of this to me, so I've read this book a number of times now. I've seen the documentary 12 times. I've read the book a number of times, right? And this kind of through line is this concept of human revolution, right? Which you talk about in the book. And the film, those words are never said, but that's the trajectory that's kind of shown. So can you say something brief? I know it's a huge concept, but can you say something brief about human revolution and what that means for Tina in the doc, in the book?
Yeah, so as I mentioned earlier, human revolution is this, it's a concept in the Soka Gakkai tradition of Buddhism, which is basically about voluntary growth, of willing yourself to grow bigger and have a more vast, expansive heart and life condition. And so all that work we've been talking about that she went through and all the chanting and the incredible work ethic, it's all a part of human revolution. And of course, we don't all have to, chant for hours and do all the things that the kind of grueling work ethic that Tina had to change our lives. It's different for everybody's circumstance, wherever you're coming from. And as we said earlier, the distance you want to travel depends on the kind of human revolution you need to accomplish in your life. But it's basically just, saying, I will take a step forward. I will keep moving forward. I will never give up, no matter what. And not diminishing your own dreams, no matter how impossible they may seem, because, like Tina says in the book and in the film, basically all of her dreams seemed impossible, right? But she never gave up. That's a key part of the human revolution spirit, is to never give up. And I think that Tina is just a magnificent embodiment of that principle of human revolution.
Yeah, I mean, I would just add, that's something TJ and I talked about very early on in the process. Is just evident from her life that is her kind of mindset, is to move forward, not, and that is, there's an inherent kind of irony and that we were interested in, and the fact that she is so defined by many people by her past in some ways, but she as a person, and that's why I think she struggles with it so much, because she as a person does not in any way, shape, or form define herself by her past. She is always about moving forward and progressing, and when she sees the thing she wants to move towards getting it. And I think that's just it's an admirable aspect of her, and something that I think is just inspiring.
Mm-hmm. Did you want to say anything, TJ, before we wrap up?
No, I'm such an interesting, and her story is such an interesting, for not to be callous, but like case study for that idea, because you can't extract some of you probably would not get the same person if it weren't for, we think of her story as very much, it's tragedy and triumph, right? And it's not that it was like tragedy first act, triumph second act. It's by nature of navigating, being a survivor, choosing to survive every day, and navigating your trauma and your PTSD. Tragedy and triumph are always kind of interwoven together. So to like Taro's point, like it's this decision you're constantly making. And Tina has said, I don't think she would change anything in the past, but she has definitely said, but I wish I didn't have to like suffer from the abuse of it, which I think is, anyone would say, yeah, that's definitely the case. But would we necessarily get the Tina Turner that we've kind of all fell in love with, and the reason we're all gathered here today to talk about? And who knows? But but at the core of it, it is, yeah. Does any of this even happen if she, some people, I think it was Oprah who said, Ike Turner was her biggest, something to the effect of her biggest nemesis, but also her biggest blessing, right? Not because of the experience she had in terms of abuse, but also because of how he ushered her into the music industry, and actually kind of refining her work ethic and seeing how he works, and kind of introducing her to this whole other world. And so, yeah, I don't know where I'm going with this, but it's just, there's something about all those, it's all the variables that make up her. What I think is interesting about her is at a certain point, we talked a lot with Katori about this. Like when we were making the film, we were struggling with this notion of like, most central characters have a goal and they're either going to achieve it or not. So usually you establish that at the top, right? She doesn't say this idea of like playing stadiums until like halfway through the film. So like, what's your central character's goal? And Katori was like, I struggled with the same thing making the musical, because a lot of things were happening to her. What's really interesting about Tina's story, which is so much embodies who she is it does feel like there's this coming of age where things are happening to her, and then at a certain point in her life, she starts to figure out how to take those things and then control them and actually have agency in her own life. And that is, I think that's always something that's so admirable and inspiring, and what makes her story timeless.
I felt that. On that note, we should close, but I hope that everyone watching will join me in thanking Dan Lindsay, TJ Martin, and Taro Gold for discussing the HBO Films documentary Tina and the memoir, Happiness Becomes You, A Guide to Changing Your Life for Good. I also want to thank Irene Lin, Executive Director of the Ho Center for Buddhist Studies at Stanford University, Stephanie Lee, and Joseph Leach. Additionally, I'd like to thank Simona Lazzarini, Michael Wallace Jr., Deshaun Roundtree, and Sean Jackson. Good evening, everyone, and thank you.